November 7th, 1985, 02:14 a.m., 101st Avenue, Ozone Park, Queens. The rain in Queens doesn't just fall, it clings. It mixes with the oil on the asphalt and the smell of cheap exhaust from the A-train rattling overhead. Outside the Ravenite social club, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of something that didn't belong: blood. Ilara Vance didn't belong here either. She was a night shift nurse at Jamaica Hospital, just trying to get her beat-up Honda started after a double shift. Then she heard it, a wet, ragged cough coming from the shadows of a brick alleyway. She saw a man slumped against a dumpster, his camel hair coat ruined by a dark, widening stain. He was holding his side, his face pale under the flickering neon sign of the club. She didn't think about the stories. She didn't think about the men in double-breasted suits who guarded that door like Cerberus. She only saw a patient. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. She knelt in the grime, her hands moving with professional precision. She ripped her own scarf to create a pressure bandage. The man looked at her, not with gratitude, but with a terrifying, piercing intensity. Click. The sound of a Zippo lighter echoed in the narrow space. A second man stepped out of the darkness. John Gotti, the dapper Don himself. He didn't look at the dying man. He looked at Ilara's hands, covered in the blood of his soldier. "You got steady hands, sweetheart," Gotti said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Most people would be running or screaming." "He's hemorrhaging," Ilara said, not looking up. "If you don't let me finish this, he's dead before the ambulance gets here." Gotti took a long drag of his cigarette, the cherry glowing like a warning light. "No ambulances. Not tonight." To understand how a nurse from a quiet street in Queens ended up with the keys to a kingdom she never wanted, you have to understand the price of mercy in a world built on debt. Ilara saved the man. She cleaned her hands on a rag, got into her car and drove home, shaking so hard she could barely steer. She thought it was over. She was wrong. As she pulled into her driveway at 4 a.m., she noticed something that made her blood turn to ice. A black Cadillac Fleetwood was already parked in front of her house, its headlights cutting through the morning mist like a predator's eyes. November 8th, 1985, 07:32 a.m., Howard Beach, Queens. The sun was trying to break through the grey Atlantic clouds, but it felt cold. Ilara hadn't slept. She sat at her kitchen table, a lukewarm cup of coffee between her hands, watching the Cadillac. It hadn't moved in 3 hours. No one had stepped out. It was just there, a silent, chrome-trimmed monument to her mistake. Then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He wasn't a tough guy from the movies. He was dressed in a sharp, charcoal suit, his hair slicked back perfectly. He carried a small leather briefcase. He walked up Ilara's path with the confidence of a man who owned the sidewalk. He knocked 3 times, not a bang, but a polite, firm rhythm. Ilara opened the door, the chain still on. "Miss Vance," the man said. He had a soft Brooklyn accent. "Mr. Gotti sends his regards, and his thanks. Frankie is going to keep his kidney because of you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. It wasn't thin. It was thick enough to stand on its side. He slid it through the crack in the door. "This is for your time, and for your silence," he said. "But there's a catch. Talent like yours. It's wasted in a public ward. The boss thinks you should have a private practice. Starting today, you're on the payroll." Ilara looked at the envelope. It represented more money than she earned in 3 years. But she knew how this worked. In this neighborhood, money wasn't a gift. It was a leash. If she took it, she wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was an accessory. "I don't want your money," she whispered. The man smiled, but his eyes remained as cold as the November wind. "It's not a donation, Ilara. It's a retainer. There's a car waiting to take you to a warehouse in Brooklyn. There's someone else who needs those steady hands. And trust me, you don't want to see what happens when the boss gets a no for an answer." Just as she was about to refuse again, the man leaned in and whispered her younger brother's name, his school address, and the time he'd be walking home that afternoon. November 8th, 1985, 11:45 p.m. An abandoned textile warehouse, Bushwick. The smell was the first thing that hit her. Damp wool, industrial grease, and the sharp antiseptic sting of iodine. They had set up a surgical suite in the middle of a hollowed-out floor. High-end equipment, stolen from hospital supply chains, sat under humming halogen lights. Ilara was pushed inside. On the table lay a man she didn't recognize, but his reputation preceded him. It was Tony Roast, a high-level earner who had supposedly been missing for 48 hours. He had 2 entry wounds in his chest. He was drowning in his own lungs. "Fix him," a voice commanded from the shadows. Ilara looked around. 2 men stood by the door, hands folded over their waists, their silhouettes jagged against the peeling wallpaper. She realized then that this was the Shadow Hospital. When the men of the 5 families got hit, they couldn't go to St. Jude's. They came here, to people like her. She felt the weight of the moral cliff she was standing on. If she saved him, he'd go back to the streets to kill again. If she let him die, she'd never leave this warehouse alive. She snapped on a pair of latex gloves. The sound, the sharp snap, was the sound of her old life ending. She began the debridement, her mind switching into a cold mechanical state. She worked for 4 hours, digging out lead fragments, while the men in the shadows watched her every move, their cigarette smoke curling into the light like ghostly fingers. She realized then that Gotti wasn't just paying for her skill, he was testing her loyalty. He wanted to see if she would flinch at the sight of a monster's blood. When she finally stepped back, sweating and exhausted, the man's pulse was stable. One of the guards stepped forward and handed her a glass of expensive scotch. "Welcome to the family, Doc," he said. As she drank, the guard's radio crackled. "We got a problem at the Ravenite." The feds weren't just watching, they were recording. And they saw the nurse. November 20th, 1985, 09:00 a.m., Federal Building, Lower Manhattan. The room was windowless and smelled of stale coffee and old paper. Across from Ilara sat Agent Miller of the FBI. He didn't look like a hero. He looked tired, his tie crooked, his eyes bags under bags. "We know where you've been, Ilara," Miller said, sliding a grainy black and white photo across the table. It was her, kneeling in the rain outside the Ravenite. "And we know about the warehouse in Bushwick. You're practicing medicine without a license in a criminal environment. That's 10 years minimum." Ilara felt the walls closing in. The effect was real, the legendary reach of the mob on one side and the crushing weight of the law on the other. She was caught in the gears. "I was saving a life," she said, her voice trembling. "That's what I do." "You're saving soldiers in a war against this city," Miller retorted. "But I'm going to give you a choice. You stay in that clinic. You keep taking their money, but you give us something. A bug, a wire, a name, just one piece of high-level intel, and we wipe your slate clean." Ilara thought about the Cadillac outside her house. She thought about her brother. She realized that the feds didn't care about her safety any more than Gotti did. She was just a pawn to be traded. She walked out of the Federal Building an hour later, her head spinning. She was now a double agent in a game where the losers didn't get fired. They got buried in the foundations of the new Marriott. When she got to her car, she found a small gift on the driver's seat. A gold locket. Inside was a picture of her brother. The message was clear. "We are watching you closer than the feds are." That night she received a call on a burner phone. It was Gotti's right-hand man. "The boss is moving. He needs a medic on site for a meeting in Manhattan. Be ready in 10 minutes. December 16th, 1985, 05 p.m., Midtown Manhattan. The air was frigid, the kind of cold that bites through wool and bone. New York was dressed for Christmas, lights twinkling on every corner, but the atmosphere in the back of the black sedan was lethal. Ilara sat between 2 hitters. Her medical bag was tucked between her feet, but it didn't just contain bandages anymore. It contained a recording device the FBI had forced her to carry. It was sewn into the lining, a tiny lump of plastic and wire that felt like a ticking bomb. "Big night," the man to her left whispered. He was checking his snub-nosed .38. "The old guard is moving out. The new king is moving in." They were talking about Paul Castellano, the head of the Gambino family. Gotti was making his move. This wasn't just a medical assignment. Ilara was being positioned as the cleaner. If things went wrong, She was there to patch up the survivors before they could be linked to the scene. The car pulled up near Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street. The sidewalk was crowded with commuters. No one noticed the men in trench coats taking their positions. Ilara watched through the tinted window, her hand hovering over the hidden wire in her bag. If she activated it now, the FBI would move in. They'd arrest everyone, including her. But if she didn't, a man was about to be executed in broad daylight. The decision cost her a piece of her soul. She watched as a black Lincoln pulled up to the curb. Paul Castellano stepped out. Ilara reached for the wire, but a heavy hand gripped her wrist. "Not yet, Doc," the hitter whispered. "Watch the show first." December 16, 1985, 05:26 p.m., East 46th Street. Pop, 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 pop. The sound wasn't like the movies. It sounded like firecrackers muffled by a heavy blanket. Then came the screaming. Through the windshield, Ilara saw the chaos. Castellano was down, his driver was down. The hitters, wearing identical Russian-style fur hats, melted back into the crowd with terrifying efficiency. "Go, now!" the hitter yelled, shoving Ilara out of the car. Her instructions were insane. She was to approach the scene under the guise of a bystander nurse to ensure Castellano was actually dead, and if he wasn't, to accidentally fail the resuscitation. She ran through the snow, her boots slipping on the slush. The smell of gunpowder was sharp in the cold air. She knelt beside Castellano. The street was a theater of the macabre. People were frozen, watching. She put her fingers to his neck. His skin was already cooling. He was gone. She looked up and saw a car slowly cruising by. In the back seat, behind the dark glass, she saw the silhouette of a man with a perfectly groomed silver mane. John Gotti was watching his predecessor die. He looked directly at her. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just watched. Ilara stood up, her hands covered in the blood of the most powerful mobster in America. She realized then that she was the only witness who knew exactly who had orchestrated the hit from the ground level. She was no longer just a nurse or a pawn. She was the most dangerous person in Queens. As the police sirens began to wail in the distance, a man in the crowd leaned in and whispered to her, "The boss says you did good. Now get in the car. We have a leak to plug." December 24, 1985, 11:12 p.m., Ozone Park, Christmas Eve. The world was supposed to be at peace, but in the basement of a social club in Ozone Park, Ilara was looking at a man tied to a chair. It was the driver who had taken her to the Sparks hit. He had been beaten beyond recognition. They suspected him of talking to the feds. "Keep him awake," Sammy the Bull Gravano said, stepping into the light. "We have questions. He keeps passing out." This was the legend effect in its darkest form. The stories of mob brutality were usually told in past tense, over drinks. But here, Ilara was the one being asked to use her medical knowledge to prolong a man's agony so they could extract information. "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice cracking. "I save lives. I don't do this." Gravano walked over to her. He was shorter than Gotti, but he radiated a more primal kind of violence. "You're whatever we tell you to be, Ilara. You've seen too much to go back to changing bedpans at Jamaica Hospital. You're part of the machinery now. If he dies before he talks, you're the one who failed the boss." She looked at the man in the chair. He looked back at her with a single swollen eye. He was begging for death. She had a syringe in her bag, a sedative that would put him under and potentially stop his heart, ending his suffering. Or she could give him the adrenaline they wanted. Every choice had a price. The theme of power was no longer abstract. It was sitting in a syringe in her hand. She looked at the camera she knew the feds had planted in her bag. She knew they were watching this. If she helped the mob, she was a criminal. If she didn't, she was a corpse. She plunged the needle into the man's arm. But as she did, she leaned into his ear and whispered a phone number, the private line to Agent Miller. January 12th, 1986, 02 a.m., Ilara's house. The Cadillac was gone, replaced by a nondescript Ford. The neighborhood felt different now. The neighbors didn't wave. They lowered their eyes. They knew she was connected. In Queens, that reputation was a shield, but it was also a shroud. Agent Miller was waiting in her kitchen. He was furious. The man you treated in the basement. He's dead, Ilara, and we didn't get the confession. You're playing both sides, and you're losing." "I gave him a chance to die with dignity," Ilara snapped. "Which is more than you gave me." "Listen to me," Miller said, leaning over the table. "Gotti is becoming a superstar. He's on the cover of Time. He thinks he's invincible. That's when they get sloppy. We're going to take down the Ravenite. We need you to plant a high-frequency bug inside his private office, not the club, his inner sanctum." "That's a suicide mission," she said. "No, it's your exit strategy. You do this, and we put you and your brother in witness protection. New names, new city, you can be a nurse again, a real one." The temptation was overwhelming, to breathe without fear, to sleep without checking the street for black Cadillacs. But Ilara knew the hierarchy. Gotti's office was swept for bugs every 3 hours. She realized she had to be smarter than the feds and the mob combined. She needed a third option. She needed to create a diversion so massive that she could disappear in the smoke. She agreed to the mission. But as Miller left, she picked up her own phone and dialed a number she had memorized from Gotti's private Rolodex. "We need to talk," she told the voice on the other end. "The feds are coming for the Ravenite tonight. January 14th, 1986, 11:30 p.m., 101st Avenue. The raid was cinematic. Dozens of agents, sirens, battering rams. The neighborhood erupted in chaos as the FBI swarmed the Ravenite. Ilara was inside. She had been summoned there an hour before. In the confusion, she was supposed to plant the bug. But as the doors were kicked in, she wasn't in Gotti's office. She was in the kitchen, calmly pouring a cup of tea. Gotti was being led out in handcuffs, looking as dapper as ever, a smirk on his face. He looked at Ilara as he passed. "The error wasn't trying, sweetheart," he whispered, echoing the very words he'd said the night they met. "The error was thinking I wouldn't know." Ilara felt her heart stop. But then she saw Miller. He looked at her, expecting a signal. She gave him nothing. The feds found bugs, yes, but they were the ones she had pointed out to Gotti's men earlier. She had traded the feds' plan to Gotti in exchange for one thing, her brother's safety and her own death. As the FBI processed the scene, a small explosion rocked the warehouse in Bushwick, the Shadow Hospital. The records, the equipment, and the evidence of Ilara's involvement went up in flames. In the eyes of the law, Ilara Vance was a victim who disappeared in the chaos of the raid. In the eyes of the Gambino family, she was a loyalist who had saved the boss from a major wiretap. But Ilara knew the truth. She was a ghost. As the sun rose over Queens, Ilara stood on the deck of a ferry leaving for Staten Island. She looked into her bag. There was no wire, no bug, just a passport and a key to a safe deposit box Gotti had given her. But as she turned to leave, she saw a black Cadillac parked at the ferry terminal waiting. February 1st, 1986, 10 a.m. An undisclosed location, Florida. The air here smelled of salt and jasmine, not exhaust and blood. Ilara sat on a porch watching the waves. She had a new name, a new life. She had played the two most powerful forces in New York against each other and walked away with her life. It was a legendary feat, whispered about in the bars of Howard Beach for years. The nurse who outsmarted the Don and the Bureau, but power always leaves a scar. She opened the safe deposit box key she had been given. Inside wasn't money. It was a single medical stethoscope made of solid gold and a note written on expensive stationery. "Every king needs a healer. Stay healthy. We might need you again. J.G." She realized then that she was never truly out. You don't leave the legend. You just become a part of the folklore. She had traded her soul for her survival, and every time she heard the purr of a large engine or the click of a lighter, she'd look over her shoulder. The Cadillac at the curb wasn't just a car. It was a reminder. In the world of crime and consequence, mercy is the most expensive thing you can ever give. Nobody knew the truth until it was too late. Ilara Vance had saved a life that night in the rain. But in doing so, she had ended her own. The story of Ilara Vance remains one of the most enigmatic footnotes in the history of the Gambino crime family. Some say she's still living under a different name in the South. Others say she never left New York at all. It makes you wonder, If you saw a man dying in an alley, knowing who he was and what it would cost you to save him, would you have done the same? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the shadows of Queens, hit the like button and subscribe for more true crime history. Tell us in the comments, is there ever a right side when you're caught between the mob and the feds? See you in the next one.